So we're in the middle of chapter 19, and Paul has been at Ephesus, and miracles are happening. Many are turning, and they've brought all of their magic stuff and everything, and they're burning it. I think this is quite a conversion. I know some of us kind of experienced that. I know when I got saved, I took all of my books I thought were inappropriate and music that I thought was inappropriate, and I burned it. I felt convicted because some of the albums I sold. I thought later I should have just burned all of it, but I wasn't quite, I guess, radical enough at the time. But I did. I burned all these albums. I burned everything just because I thought, well, I want to be free. I want to just follow Jesus. I don't want any past influence to be part of me. But that's what they were doing here with their magic stuff and all their practices. And it wasn't a small thing. It says they counted out the price of it, 50,000 pieces of silver. I got a footnote in the Bible was quite a while ago. Drachma, approximately a day's wage, probably 50,000 Greek drachmas. So that's like 50,000 days' wages. I mean, come on. A lot of people brought a lot of stuff, and it was very valuable stuff in that market. But they were willing to depart with it because they saw the reality of Jesus and the power and the delivering power of Jesus to free them from all these demons, which probably in this age we're about due for that kind of cleansing once again. It says, verse 21, now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in his spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So Paul's got a desire of where he's wanting to head. But it says, verse 23, at about this time there arose no small disturbance concerning the way. The way is a reference to what Paul's preaching, following as a Christian, following Jesus. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. And these he gathered together with workmen of similar trades and said, men, you know that our prosperity depends upon these businesses. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. So Paul's preaching this and saying that you don't make a god. God made us. He's the God who made heaven and earth, and he's created us and that kind of thing. Well, they're making these things out of silver and calling them gods. And since Paul is preaching this thing, they're losing money. Their business is starting to dry up. And he's preaching this all through the region. And it says, verse 28, and when they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Well, there was Artemis, this statue, supposed to have fallen out of heaven, fallen from Zeus, and fallen out, and they worshipped, and it fell in this region. And so it was like that was the big thing about their region was Artemis or Diana, it called in some other, I guess maybe the Roman name. And says, verse 29, and the city was filled with confusion. They rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. So, and it says, verse 30, when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. So there's this riot going on. And here, it's interesting, the word assembly here in verse 30 is actually the word ecclesia, which is used for church in all the rest of the scriptures, the assembly. When Paul wanted to go into the assembly, but it's not talking about assembly of believers here, it's talking about assembly of rioters. So the word can be used in different contexts. But the rest of the disciples didn't want him to go in because the chaos was so strong at this point. And they were shouting, some were shouting one thing and some another, and it was just a total confusion. And finally it says in verse 35, after quieting the multitude, the town clerk said, men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of Ephesus is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? Since then these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers nor robbers of temples, nor blasphemers of our goddess. And so this guy comes in, he's the town clerk, he quiets everybody down, says, you need to settle down, this is going to be bad for us regarding the Roman Empire and things if you guys don't settle down. And see, it says in verse 40, for indeed we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's affair, since there is no real cause for it, and in this connection we shall be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. So they're wanting to, make sure that they're accountable before their government. And it says, after saying this, he dismissed the assembly. And once again, there, that this assembly was this rioting group. But the word there actually is a word, ecclesia, that we use for church. So ecclesia is a very good word, called out ones, but it just depends on what ecclesia is it. Is it the ecclesia, the called out ones of God, or is it ecclesia called out ones, in this case, of Artemis and the Ephesians and that kind of thing? And it was just a rioting mob at the time. But this finally is dismissed, and Paul isn't beat up for a change. Usually he's getting beat up and put in prison. He gets out of this one okay. There was some danger for some of his traveling companions. And so that's where we leave at the end of chapter 19. And his travels in chapter 20 begin, verse 1, it says, "And after the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and when he had exhorted them and taken his leave of them, he departed to go to Macedonia." So he's leaving Ephesus, heading over to Macedonia. And basically what we're looking here is Paul's making a return, beginning to make his return trip, heading back to Antioch, back home. And he's passing through these places and checking on the believers and very concerned about everything that's going on in all of these places. So that moves us into chapter 20. And there's an interesting episode here in chapter 20. He's at Troas, and he's speaking, and he was intending to leave, but he stayed on and kept speaking, and they're having a meeting, and a guy named Eutychus comes up. Eutychus got his name in the Bible here, and he was a young man, and he was sitting in the windowsill, in the window area, and as Paul preached into the night, he fell asleep, fell out of the window, fell 3 stories, and died. And so I was glad to hear that I'm not the only one that puts people to sleep when I preach, but Paul actually did too. Somewhat comforting. Well, Paul went down, and it says, verse 9, "And there was a certain young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep, and Paul kept on talking. He was overcome by sleep and fell down from the 3rd floor and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and fell upon him and said, and after embracing him, he said, 'Do not be troubled, for his life is in him.' And when he had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took away the boy alive and were greatly comforted." So Paul, after the guy fell asleep on his preaching, raised him from the dead, and that became, a really powerful message for that area, for Troas, I'm sure, that this young man was raised from the dead. And then we see he goes from Troas to Miletus, and it's just taking his journey. He says in verse 16, he's hurrying back to Jerusalem, so if possible he can be there on the day of Pentecost. So Paul apparently liked to celebrate the annual feasts of Israel, just like the rest of the Jews, and so he's trying to get back to Jerusalem in time to celebrate Pentecost, which is the Feast of Weeks, commemorating the Jews the giving of the law in their hearts, but commemorating to the Christians the day that Pentecost fully came and the Holy Spirit fell on the 120 and they began to speaking in tongues, the day that the law became written in people's hearts. And so for Paul, it's a really special time because it's both the historic celebration that the Jewish people had, but also it's already been one of these things that's been fulfilled. Two of the feasts, the annual feasts in Israel that they celebrated, the Passover and Pentecost, now have been fulfilled in this time. And Paul wants to celebrate them with the Jews, because not only do they celebrate the past history, but man, this has been made alive now, and it's been fulfilled in our day. So what we're looking at here is they move into verse 17, and it says, chapter 20, "And from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called to him the elders of the church. And when they had come to him, they said to him, 'You yourselves know from the first day that I set foot in Asia how I was with you the whole time.'" So he begins to give a message to the elders of the church in Ephesus. And elders, this is the governing group, what we would call the pastors. The word pastor, singular, is not even used in the New Testament. And pastors is only used, like in this passage a little later, it's actually shepherds. And where it says he's appointed pastors and teachers. But so what we're looking at here, he's called the leadership from Ephesus to him, and he's going to give him a speech, and it's going to be a very emotional message he gives as he's giving his farewell to these believers, as he knows that this is the last time he's going to see them.